You're likely aware that in just a few days' time, Bitcoin is set to pass a major milestone and undergo an important change in an event known as a halving, or halvening, depending on who you ask. But what exactly are halvings? Why do they occur, and why should you care? The short answer is halvings are a 50% reduction in the number of new Bitcoin that can be created in each new block. Halvings are an integral part of Bitcoin's design, and they're set to occur after a certain number of blocks have been created. It works out to be roughly once every 4 years, and in about 120 years' time, so many halvings will have taken place that the number of Bitcoin that could be created in each block will actually be smaller than the smallest unit of a Bitcoin, and at that point, no new coins will be created at all, permanently capping Bitcoin's supply just a sliver under 21 million coins. That's a very quick and shallow summary of the halving, and maybe that's enough for you. If so, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I see you again. But if you want to really understand the halving and you want to think about the significance or perhaps insignificance of them, then do watch on. But to understand that, we first need to take a bit of a step back and think about why Bitcoin was created and how it works. Bitcoin seems to have been created, at least in part, as a response and objection to the monetary policies of central banks, who try to manipulate the rate of money creation to maintain high employment and grow economies. The thing is, that kind of manipulation is very difficult to do well, and arguably has a number of negative side effects, leading some people to conclude that it's not worth the risk. Instead, they say it would be better to return to something like the gold standard, where money was scarce and unmanipulable, where human fallibility couldn't unintentionally ruin economies and destroy lives, and where no individual or institution could claim or abuse the colossal power that comes with controlling money. While many of the people falling into this school of thought simply spent many of the last decades screaming about what they thought was an unfair and broken system, one mysterious individual going by the name Satoshi Nakamoto was hard at work creating a potential avenue for change, a gold-like digital currency that could form the backbone of an entirely new economy. His money would have a fixed, almost impossible to change maximum supply of 21 million coins, and they would be minted according to a predetermined 130-year schedule. He called this currency Bitcoin, and in January 2009, he released it to the world. Satoshi's new money didn't just remove the central issuer of money, it removed central power players altogether. In Bitcoin, banks aren't required to safely store funds, and payment processing companies aren't needed to validate and carry out transactions. But somebody needs to be doing these things, so if there aren't any companies like PayPal or Venmo to process transactions, then who's doing it? The answer is a collection of thousands of uncoordinated, independent entities distributed all over the world. All of them listening out for new Bitcoin transactions, validating them, and then adding them to a list of official Bitcoin transactions. You can think of these entities as a bit like participants in a colossal group project, all logging into and trying to update a Google document. As you can imagine, with no way to communicate with one another and work in unison, things would devolve into chaos pretty quickly and the system would break down. What's needed is some kind of coordination mechanism, and it must fulfill two important criteria. It must not accidentally reintroduce central parties, and it must be able to continuously function despite any number of unknown individuals joining or leaving the group without a moment's notice. The mechanism that Bitcoin uses is essentially a maths-based guessing game. In this, participants continuously plug different numbers into an equation until they, or somebody else, stumbles upon a combination of inputs that produces an answer below some target value. Whoever is first to find the solution wins the right to be a temporary leader and add a block of validated transactions to Bitcoin's transaction history. In our Google Docs example, this would be a bit like all of the participants filling a hat with raffle tickets and continuously pulling them out until they happen to retrieve a ticket that had a number less than, say, 10 on it. The first person to find one of those tickets gets the right to make any adjustments they want to the document, and once they've finished, everybody refills their hats and starts all over again for the next round. In this scenario, it's fairly intuitive to say that the chance of any individual finding a winning ticket is based on two main factors: luck and the speed with which they can pull a ticket out of a hat and check what's written on it. Somebody who can get through 60 tickets in a minute has a much greater chance of finding a winning ticket than somebody who can only process 5, but there's a chance that the slower person happens to pull a winning ticket on their first try. Knowing this, we can say that the mechanism does fulfill the first of our criteria, as anybody who wanted to become a proper leader in this system would have to retrieve tickets faster than everybody else put together in order to win more often than everybody else put together, and therefore become a dominant and central player. That is very unlikely to happen, and so we can discount it as fairly unrealistic. What we may have, though, is an issue fulfilling the second of the requirements, because as more and more people join the game, the rounds are going to continuously get faster until eventually so many people have joined that it becomes quite likely that multiple people pull a winning ticket from the hat on their first try. And when that happens, the system collapses back into chaos. Bitcoin solves this by automatically adjusting the game every couple of weeks to make it easier or harder to win by moving the equation's target either up or down, using the average time taken to complete the game since the previous adjustment to determine the size and direction of the change. These events are called difficulty adjustments, and so far they've done quite a good job of maintaining a 10-minute gap on average between blocks throughout Bitcoin's life. Difficulty adjustments are an absolutely crucial and fairly underrated element of Bitcoin's design, and they are what has allowed it to continue functioning properly as more and more participants have joined the game, and perhaps more importantly, as computers have improved. Remember, the speed with which somebody can trial different solutions to Bitcoin's guessing game is a major determining factor in their chance of winning it, and that has driven people to use faster, better, and more specialized machines over time. The problem with this is today, these specialized machines are very expensive to buy and consume vast amounts of electricity, which is also quite expensive. And that creates quite a barrier to entry for anybody who wants to take part in validating and confirming Bitcoin transactions. In fact, it's a significant enough barrier to entry to put off even the most enthusiastic Bitcoin supporter. What's needed is some kind of incentive, a financial reward that can cover the running costs and potentially even generate some profit. Satoshi realized that this was actually the solution to a seemingly separate problem of fairly distributing new Bitcoin without some kind of central bank. Instead of just awarding the winner of the guessing game the right to add a block of transactions to Bitcoin's transaction history, they would also be awarded some number of new Bitcoin that could then be sold on to cover the running costs. The prize that is awarded for winning the competition is called a block reward, and the introduction of the block reward alters the competition and makes it analogous to gold mining, where companies spend colossal amounts of time, effort, and money digging up and processing the earth in hope of uncovering a scarce commodity that can be sold to cover costs and hopefully generate profit. Because of this, Bitcoin's payment processors have become known as miners. But now we have a new problem. How can Bitcoin's all-important 21 million coin hard cap be reconciled with this need to continually financially incentivize miners? The solution comes in two parts. First, transaction fees are introduced to enhance the incentive to mine. These fees are paid by the creator of a transaction, who sends slightly more Bitcoin than they want the recipient to actually receive, and allow the miners to claim the difference. A useful byproduct of this is a kind of transaction prioritization, as anybody who wants a particularly rapid transaction can pay a bit extra to ensure miners take note of it and include it in their next block. The second part of the solution is to gradually transition to a fee-only incentive model by slowly reducing the number of new Bitcoin that can be created in each block. And this is where the halving comes in. The reduction in block reward could have been handled in any number of ways, perhaps the most obvious being a constant gradual decline over time, but for whatever reason Bitcoin was designed to have block rewards slashed at regular intervals. More specifically, the number of new Bitcoin that can be created in each block halves every 210,000 blocks, and the transition from one rate of issuance to the next is called the halving. For the first 210,000 blocks in Bitcoin's life, miners could claim 50 Bitcoin as their reward, but eventually, after a total of 33 halvings, this number will fall to less than 1 Satoshi, the smallest unit of a Bitcoin. At that point, unable to be represented in the system, block rewards will cease entirely, permanently capping Bitcoin's supply at 21 million coins. Actually, if you want to be picky, it caps it at 20,999,999.9796 Bitcoin, and if you want to be really picky, you can also say that some miners never claim the full block reward and some other things went on that reduces that even more, but let's just call it 21 million. Because the mathematical puzzle completed by miners is always designed to take about 10 minutes to complete, it's possible to estimate the date that the final halving will take place, with the answer being sometime around 2140. Similar estimates can be made for every other halving leading up to that point, and the long and short of it is halvings occur every 4 years. Bitcoin has already undergone 2 halvings and the third is rapidly approaching. The first took place on November 28, 2012, cutting the initial issuance rate of 50 Bitcoin per block to 25. This was further reduced to 12.5 on the 9th of July 2016, and it will fall to just 6.25 Bitcoin per block on May 12th this year. The next halving could be considered symbolically significant for a couple of reasons, and both relate to solidifying Bitcoin's position as a gold-like store of value. First, following this halving, Bitcoin supply will only increase or inflate by around 1.8% per year. This is lower than the target rate of inflation in most developed countries and firmly within the ballpark of gold, which increases by about 1.3% per year according to figures on gold.org. Potentially, this enhances Bitcoin's credibility as a hedge against inflation. Second, the halving is now taking place against a backdrop that juxtaposes it perfectly, with central banks all over the world printing money faster than ever before in a desperate attempt to prop up lockdown economies. If there was ever a moment to showcase the difference between these two systems and the schools of thought going into them, this is certainly it. Of course, this central bank money printing is very likely a necessity at this time, and in many ways it shows the benefits of having centrally controlled money. But it also draws attention to the dangers of it and raises major questions about the long-term impact of this behaviour, about our ability to later wean economies off of frequent and massive stimulus packages, and especially in countries like the US, where vast quantities of money have been created but very little seemingly given to the people that need it, about how this newly created money is and should be allocated. For people with these kinds of concerns, the idea of an asset that runs without interruption or intervention, that remains blissfully unaware of the external chaos in the world, and that exclusively follows a transparent algorithm describing a progressively tightening monetary policy, may well start to make sense. Aside from acting as a regular reminder of Bitcoin's scarcity, does the halving really do anything? Does it have any impact on Bitcoin or the ecosystem that's been developed around it? Well, everybody has their own opinions on this, but generally they can be broken down into two major narratives. The first is about miners, who operate in an incredibly competitive environment with often razor-thin profit margins, leaving them rather exposed to any loss of income. It's fairly obvious that without a significant increase in transaction fees or Bitcoin's price, miner income will halve after a halving, and that could be catastrophic for many miners' businesses and force them, certainly those paying a lot for electricity, to turn off their machines, at least until things change and mining becomes profitable again. The second major narrative is about Bitcoin's price, arguing that it should increase in the wake of a halving. The idea here is that miners act as a constant source of sell pressure, and that pressure is reduced by the halving as there's simply fewer Bitcoin available for them to sell. At the same time, there's no reason for demand to change or decrease significantly around a halving, so the decrease in supply meets a constant level of demand and prices are driven higher. There's also a slightly less popular version of this second narrative that says Bitcoin's price will decrease immediately after a halving, as some miners completely shut up shop and sell everything they own. Only after all of these failing miners have capitulated will prices rebound and benefit from the reduced sell pressure. Personally, I think these ideas sound nice on paper, but I'm skeptical about their ability to hold up amid the complexities of the real world and remain true for each and every halving. Sure, some miners that are less professionally run or operate with particularly high costs may become unprofitable after a halving and be forced to shut down, but many of them will have been preparing for the halving for months, setting up the latest and cheapest to run mining equipment, stockpiling cash to survive a period of unprofitability, and making use of various derivative products to minimise those losses as much as possible. These miners won't need to turn their machines off, because they'll have anticipated a period of losses and other challenges that they'll face in the coming months, and they'll have mitigated these things as much as possible so they can continue operations and accumulate as much Bitcoin as they can. I'll admit though that my thoughts have changed slightly with regards to the halving's impact on Bitcoin's price. Not that long ago I would have said that because miners contribute only a small portion of Bitcoin's overall trade volume, and because they'll be looking to maximise profits and minimise disruption to the price, by making use of over-the-counter trading desks and holding back as much Bitcoin as possible to sell at higher prices, they shouldn't contribute that much to Bitcoin's price determination anyway, so reducing the amount that they can sell by 50% wouldn't be all that important. However, as Coinmetrics recently pointed out in their State of the Network newsletter, miners may have an outsized influence on Bitcoin's price as they permanently withdraw cash from the market while most other traders just cycle funds between different crypto assets, or temporarily cash out to buy back in at lower prices. With that in mind, I agree that halvings may be more beneficial to Bitcoin's price than I previously believed, though I still think their contribution is relatively small compared to many other factors. In fact, small compared to many other factors is probably a good summary of the overall impact of halvings. I wouldn't expect anything dramatic to take place simply because a halving did, but I think they can feed into and potentially exaggerate trends that were already occurring. For example, following this halving, we may well see a large number of miners turning off machines because there's still significant usage of previous generation, less efficient machines that were being phased out anyway, and also because many miners have already taken a substantial economic hit because of March's coronavirus-related sell-off. These circumstances surrounding the next halving will likely be completely different, just as the circumstances surrounding each of the previous two halvings were completely different, and that means the results following the halving will also be quite unique. So in short, halvings are a bit like birthdays or New Year's. They're milestone moments that are fun to celebrate, but ultimately they're quite insignificant. Let's imagine for the moment though that halvings really did have a sizable impact on things. Let's imagine that after this halving or another one in the future, many miners found themselves running with unbearable losses and they were forced to shut down. What would happen in these circumstances? Would Bitcoin be in trouble? Could it die? It seems reasonable to think that a large number of these crucial operators going offline at the same time would be quite disastrous for Bitcoin, but in reality, it would be little more than a short-term inconvenience. Remember, the guessing game that these miners compete in to win block rewards automatically adjusts itself on a regular basis, so even if a large number of participants dropped out, it wouldn't be long before the game was updated to account for this. Previously, I said that these adjustments take place every 2 weeks, but in reality it takes place after a set number of blocks have been created, 2016 to be specific. So, if the blocks were being produced much slower than usual, it would actually take a bit longer than 2 weeks between adjustments. For example, if 50% of miners all called it quits at once, then blocks would only be found after 20 minutes instead of 10, and so it could be up to a month between the adjustments. That might be a bit annoying if you had a particularly high priority transaction to make in that time, but it's not the end of the world. And then, after at most a month, things would go back to normal and you'd resume with 10-minute block times. In these circumstances, the miners that manage to persevere through the difficult and potentially unprofitable times will be rewarded after the adjustment with a much greater chance of discovering a block and therefore netting the block reward. This acts as quite an incentive, particularly for the miners with very low running costs or who have prepaid long-term electricity contracts, to keep going even when things are difficult. And it virtually guarantees that there will never be a hypothetical event known as a miner death spiral, where so many miners shut down at once that no new Bitcoin blocks can be created and the whole network grinds to a halt. From this, hopefully you can see that even if halvings did have a dramatic negative impact on Bitcoin's price or on the profitability of miners, it wouldn't matter for long. Bitcoin is far too resilient a system for these things to make any real difference to its operation. While Bitcoin may be largely unaffected by each individual halving and other abrupt changes to the system, could the cumulative impact of many halvings and the steady reduction of block rewards start to cause some problems later on? Will miners still be sufficiently incentivized after 10 halvings? What about after 20 or all 33? Will transaction fees ever really be enough to properly incentivize miners? Remember, if one miner is able to accumulate enough computing power to trial solutions to Bitcoin's guessing game faster than everyone else combined, then they'll win more often than everybody else put together, and effectively become a controller for Bitcoin. This gives them the power to meddle with Bitcoin in all kinds of detrimental ways, and it's for this reason that people are concerned about Bitcoin's security as it transitions to a purely transaction fee-based incentive model. Today, transaction fees form only a small portion of the overall miner income, often totaling less than 1 Bitcoin in each block. But the hope is that, over time, more people will become interested in and make use of Bitcoin, and that will drive transaction fees higher. We've already seen something like this happen during 2017's Bitcoin bubble, when there were so many transactions taking place that some users had to pay tens or even hundreds of dollars to ensure miners paid attention to their transaction and included it in a block. This drove cumulative transaction fees to highs of almost 11 Bitcoin per block, almost matching the block reward at the time. This proves that transaction fees can, at times, total enough to properly incentivize miners. Now we just need to find ways to consistently and sustainably maintain that, without such a compromise to the user experience. Various developments are in the works to assist with this, and the general idea behind many of them is to combine large numbers of transactions into just one or two that are recorded into blocks. This means people either need to make far fewer costly on-chain transactions, or a large number of people can split a very high fee among all of them, so nobody has to pay that much individually. So, although we can't be absolutely certain that Bitcoin will survive its transition to a fee-only incentive model, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic that it will. So, we've seen that Bitcoin relies on miners to function properly and to remain secure, and that these miners are economically incentivized using both freshly created Bitcoin from block rewards and recycled Bitcoin in transaction fees. To maintain a hard cap supply, the block reward is slashed in half every 4 years in events known as halvings, eventually reducing miner incentives to transaction fees alone. While these reduced incentives may make some miners unprofitable and force them to shut down, Bitcoin is able to react quite easily to these changes in the number of miners, and it also looks well placed to survive its eventual transition to a fee-only incentive model as the 21 million Bitcoin supply cap is reached. So that is Bitcoin's halving and the implications of it, and I really do hope you understand it a bit better now and found this useful and informative in some way. Thank you very much for watching, have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.